Chapter 16. The Great Leap Forward, from the 1920s to the 1950s. What set of miracles created it? I refuse to recognize that there are impossibilities. I cannot discover that anyone knows enough about anything on this earth definitely to say what is and what is not possible. Henry Ford. Introduction. The great leap forward of the American level of labor productivity that occurred in the middle decades of the 20th century is one of the greatest achievements in all of economic history. Had the economy continued to grow at the average annual growth rate that prevailed during 1870 to 1928, by 1950, output per hour would have been 52% higher than it had been in 1928. Instead, the reality was a 1928 to 50 increase of 99%, a marked acceleration of the pace of economic growth compared to everything that had created growth in the 6 decades before 1928, including the Roaring Twenties themselves. At first glance, it may seem a surprise that so much of the progress of the 20th century occurred between 1928 and 1950. The great inventions of the late 19th century had by 1928 already reached most urban households. Light was produced by electricity in cities and towns alike, and almost all urban housing units were connected by then not just to electricity, but also to gas, telephone, running water, and sewer lines. The motor vehicle had a more widespread effect than electricity, transforming not just urban but also rural America. By 1926, fully 93% of Iowa farmers owned a motor vehicle, starting from 0% in 1900, and the ratio of motor vehicle registrations to the number of households in the entire country had by 1929 reached 90%. Part of the puzzle of the Great Leap Forward is that the data and history do not provide us with a steady, unbroken record of progress between 1928 and 1950. Rather, the operation of the normal economy was obscured as the decade of the Great Depression was followed by the production miracle of World War II. The macroeconomic lights out is like a blackout curtain that prevents us from determining any aspect of normal macroeconomic behavior during the Depression and war years. From 1929 to 1933, output, hours of work, and employment collapsed. With so many machines idle, and so many buildings empty, we can learn little about the pace of technical progress or innovation during those years. And the distortions continued through the partial recovery of 1933 to 37, the severe recession of 1938, and then the continuous explosion of economic output from 1938 to 1945, as the economy was revived by wartime spending so enormous that in 1944, military spending amounted to 80% of the size of the entire economy in 1939, and real GDP in 1944 was almost double that of 1939. And then, to the surprise of many economists, after the stimulus of wartime spending was removed swiftly in 1945 to 47, the economy did not collapse. Some mysterious elixir had converted the production achievements of the arsenal of democracy into a post-war cornucopia of houses, automobiles, and appliances. Our task in this chapter is to shed light on this fundamental puzzle in American economic history. What allowed the economy of the 1950s and the 1960s so unambiguously to exceed what would have been expected on the basis of trends estimated from the 6 decades before 1928. Our analysis in this chapter takes the word leap seriously. It combines substance and speculation, and asks not just about the pace of innovation, but also about what could have happened with the lights out that permanently changed the economy's capacity to produce. Though this book is about long-run trends in the standard of living rather than about business cycle fluctuations, tantalizing questions are suggested by the interaction of cycles and trends. Did the Great Depression permanently retard U.S. growth? Would post-war prosperity have occurred without World War II? How were labor input, capital input, and productivity transformed between 1928 and 1950? The chapter begins by quantifying the leap. The first step is to ask, the leap in what? By definition, output per person is equal to labor productivity, output per hour, times hours per person. We define the leap for each of these three components relative to a trend line that grows after 1928 at the same rate recorded by each concept between 1870 and 1928. We discovered that by 1950, productivity growth was far above the earlier trend, whereas real GDP per person was modestly above the previous trend, and that by definition implies that hours per person were below their historic trend. The search for explanations begins with elementary economics. An increase in real wages tends to boost productivity as firms substitute capital for labor. The New Deal passed legislation that made it much easier for labor unions to organize. In addition to pushing up real wages, labor unions also largely achieved their century-old goal of the 8-hour day. As a result, hours per person were markedly lower in the early post-war years than they had been in the 1920s. The traditional measure of the pace of innovation and technological change is total factor productivity, TFP, output divided by a weighted average of labor and capital input. The measure of labor input allows for changes not only in the number of labor hours that are worked in a given year, but also in the average educational attainment of the labor force. Our measure of capital input is newly developed for this book and adjusts for unusual aspects of investment behavior during the 1930s and 1940s. Details of these adjustments are provided in the data appendix. The most novel aspect of this chapter is its assertion that World War II itself was perhaps the most important contributor to the Great Leap. We will examine the beneficial aspect of the war both through the demand and supply side of the economy. The war created household saving that, after 1945, was spent on consumer goods that had been unavailable during the war, the classic case of pent-up demand. A strong case can be made that World War II, however devastating in terms of deaths and casualties among the American military, albeit much less than the greater toll of deaths and wounded among other combatants, nevertheless represented an economic miracle that rescued the American economy from the secular stagnation of the late 1930s. In fact, this chapter will argue that the case is overwhelming for the economic rescue interpretation of World War II along every conceivable dimension, from education and the GI Bill to the deficit-financed mountain of household saving that gave a new middle class the ability to purchase the consumer durables made possible by the Second Industrial Revolution. The supply effects are more subtle and interesting, and include a vast expansion of the nation's capital stock, as the government paid for new factories and equipment that were then operated by private firms to create aircraft, ships, and weapons. The expansion of government capital began during the 1930s and included not just factories to produce military goods during the war itself, but a surge of investment in infrastructure in both the 1930s and the 1940s, as the nation's highway network was extended and major projects such as the Golden Gate Bridge, the Bay Bridge, the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, and the Boulder, later Hoover, Dam were completed. Another supply channel boosted productivity through learning by doing. The supply constraints of the 1942-45 war forced each firm to devise new techniques to boost output, while constrained by limited capital and labor resources. The explanation of the Great Leap then turns to the innovations of the 1920s that had not been fully exploited by 1929, as well as to the additional inventions of the 1930s and 1940s. By some measures, The 1930s were the most productive decade in terms of the numbers of inventions and patents granted relative to the size of the economy. Previous chapters of this book have pointed to technological progress during the 1930s, including in the quality and diffusion of electric appliances, improvements in the quality of automobiles, the arrival of commercial air transport, the arrival of network radio programs available in every farm and hamlet, the culmination of growth in motion picture quality and attendance, and continuing improvements in health with the invention of the first sulfa drugs. Inventions in the 1930s and 1940s also occurred in other areas not explicitly treated in previous chapters of the book, especially chemicals, plastics, and oil exploration and production. How big was the leap? Output, productivity, and hours. Throughout this book, we have equated the concept of the standard of living to real GDP per person, while recognizing that increases in real GDP per person greatly understate the rise in the true standard of living, that is, household welfare. This understatement arises because of the inherent difficulty of measuring the value of new inventions, all of which are excluded from historical measures of real GDP. The use of official real GDP data in this section recognizes that there is an unknown degree of understatement of growth rates as a result of the unmeasured benefits of new inventions. The magnitude of the Great Leap Forward is illustrated first in Figure 16.1. The straight upward sloping line on the log scale represents the trend of growth between 1870 and 1928 in output per hour and output per person, each growing at an annual rate of 1.9% per year. But actual output per hour and output per person did not behave alike after 1928. The main features of Figure 16.1 pop off the page. First, deviations of actual values from the trend lines were minor before 1928, but starting with the Great Depression, the two lines diverge radically, both from trend and from each other. Output per person, as shown by the white line, collapsed during 1929–33 and soared during World War II. Then, during the post-war years, output per person was between 10% and 20% above trend from 1947 to 1964, and then between 20% and 35% above trend from 1965 to 2014. Output per hour, labor productivity, hardly declined at all in the Great Contraction of 1929 to 33, and was back to its trend by 1935. By 1941, productivity was 11% above trend, then reached 32% above trend by 1957, and 44% above trend in 1972. The post-1928 productivity growth miracle is perhaps the central puzzle in the American economic history of the 20th century. Figure 16.2 helps us better understand why the time path of output per person and of labor productivity diverged so much after 1928. It displays the percent deviation from trend of output per hour and per person, and also adds an additional third line, the deviation from the historical 1870 to 1928 growth path of hours per person. Several distinctive time intervals stand out. The Great Depression of 1929 to 41 exhibits a parallel collapse and recovery in output per person and hours per person, implying by definition that output per hour showed little cyclical variation in the 1930s. The giant peak of all series, as achieved during World War II in 1944, reveals that the great upsurge of output per person from 1933 to 1944 was almost evenly divided between output per hour and hours per person. The core of the puzzle addressed in this chapter occurs immediately after the war. Output per person dropped from 39% to 14% above trend between 1944 and 1950. Hours per person declined even more, from positive 18 to negative 13% over the same time span. The big surprise was that labor productivity appears to have permanently increased as a result of the war. Table 16.1 shows the percent log ratios to the 1870 to 1928 trend for the 3 series for selected years. These are the base year of 1928, 1941, the last year before World War II, 1944, the peak year of war production, 1950, 1957, and finally the pivotal year 1972, when the ratio of labor productivity to trend reached its post-war peak. The story told in Table 16.1 identifies a set of questions to be addressed in this chapter. First, note that output per hour moved steadily higher relative to the 1870 to 1928 trend in each of the years shown. Why did this productivity growth surge occur? The deviations from trend of hours per person are somewhat easier to understand and include the role of labor unions in achieving the 8-hour day in the 1935 to 50 interval, as well as the baby boom itself in raising the population of children and thus reducing hours of work for the total population as mothers stayed home to take care of their families during the 1950s. Because the decline in hours per person relative to trend was not as large in magnitude as the rise in productivity, the post-war economy enjoyed a level of output per person substantially above the extension of the 1870 to 1928 trend. What caused higher real wages? The role of the New Deal and labor unions. To explain the upsurge in labor productivity, the best place to start is with basic economic theory. In a competitive market, the marginal product of labor equals the real wage. And economists have shown that labor's marginal product under specified conditions is the share of labor in total income times output per hour. If the income share of labor remains constant, then the growth rate of the real wage should be equal to that of labor's average product. The same thing as labor productivity. Could an increase in real wages have caused, directly or indirectly, the upsurge in labor productivity that occurred between the 1920s and 1950s? Figure 16.3 copies from Figure 16.2 the black line that shows the percent deviation of output per hour from its 1870 to 1928 trend line. Compared to this is shown the deviation from trend of the best available measure of the real inflation-adjusted wage. In the late 1930s, the real wage began to rise more quickly than its pre-1928 trend, as did labor productivity. As shown in Figure 16.3 and in the fourth line of Table 16.1, by 1941, the real wage was already almost 14% above trend, somewhat higher than the 11% ratio in trend of labor productivity. The rise of the real wage may reflect in part the effects of New Deal legislation, particularly the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 to 35 and the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. Because only a few industries were unionized in the late 1930s, primarily those dealing in automobiles and other durable goods, the effect of unions in boosting real wages may have spilled over to other less unionized industries. The index of the real wage relative to trend remained roughly the same as for productivity through 1950, and then between 1950 and 2007 was higher than the same ratio for productivity. The fact that both the real wage rose above its trend by more than productivity between 1950 and 1973 implies that labor's share in total income increased over this interval. The reverse occurred during 1973 to 2014. The growth of labor's share in the 1950s and 1960s is part of the phenomenon that Claudia Goldin and Robert Margo have called, with reference to the distribution of income, the Great Compression, and the gradual shrinkage of labor's income share after the mid-1970s is consistent with rising inequality over the past 3 decades. We return to the inequality phenomenon in Chapter 18. The increase relative to the pre-1928 trend of both the real wage and labor productivity was in part a result of a long history of labor union agitation for higher wages and shorter hours that culminated in the 1930s. The 8-hour day was a provision of the National Labor Relations Wagner Act of 1935, which set out new rules that governed the formation of unions and the conduct of free elections for labor union recruitment. 3 years later, the modern system of the 40-hour week with mandatory time-and-a-half overtime for hours beyond 40 was put into effect by the New Deal's Fair Labor Standards Act, passed in 1938. The shift to the 8-hour day must have had a direct effect in boosting productivity. Edward Dennison has called attention to the effect of shorter hours in reducing worker fatigue and thus improving worker efficiency. In addition, many establishments reorganized themselves to reduce business hours and conduct the same amount of business in 8 hours as they formerly did in 10 hours per day. However, the main upward stimulus to productivity must have come from the impetus of higher hourly wages, particularly in the late 1930s, that led firms to economize on the use of labor. This helps us to understand the explosion of productivity during World War II. The role of labor quality, the surge in educational attainment. The study of the sources of productivity growth is called growth accounting and was pioneered by Robert Solow in the 1950s, with seminal additional contribution in the 1960s from Edward Dennison, Svi Griliches, and Dale Jorgensen. This approach subdivides the growth in labor productivity into 4 categories. Increases in labor quality, usually represented by changes in educational attainment. Increases in the quantity of capital relative to the quantity of labor. Increases in the quality of capital. The leftovers, alternately called total factor productivity or the residual, or even the measure of our ignorance, while often treated as a measure of innovation and technical progress. The residual incorporates every aspect, not just of major innovation, but of incremental tinkering and anything else that improves efficiency, including the movement from low productivity jobs in agriculture to higher productivity jobs in the cities. Labor quality is often measured by educational attainment, and there were significant increases in the educational attainment of American youth both before and after World War II. Between 1900 and 1970, the high school graduation rates of U.S. teenagers rose from 6% to 80%, a truly monumental change that contributed to productivity growth. By 1940, half of American youth had completed high school, and a substantial fraction of the rest had experienced high school classes before dropping out. This created a more capable workforce to confront the production challenges of the arsenal of democracy during 1941 to 45. Workers who had a high school education were better able to operate new and more complex machinery, both on the assembly line and in the office. The period of most rapid increase in 4-year college graduation rates was in the decade 1940 to 50. This was thanks in large part to the GI Bill, passed in 1944, which provided financing for every World War II veteran to attend college at the expense of the federal government. Because 16.1 million people, or 12% of the 1940 population, had served during the war, the effect was substantial and swamped the nation's colleges with new enrollees during 1946 to 49. The GI Bill also provided for support if a veteran wanted to complete a high school degree, as well as low-interest loans for home purchases and unemployment compensation for a veteran's first year out of the military. There are other ways of expressing the improvement in educational attainment. The fraction of the U.S. workforce who had only an elementary school education declined from 75% in 1915 to 30% in 1960, to a mere 3% in 2005. Over the same 1915 to 2005 interval, the fraction who had four-year college degrees, postgraduate degrees, and enrollment in college courses without graduation increased from 4% to 48%. Because the rise in educational attainment proceeded at a steady pace before and after 1928, it does not contribute anything to the explanation of the main puzzle explored in this chapter. Why did labor productivity grow so much more quickly between 1928 and 1972 than it had before 1928? The increase of educational attainment, an undeniably positive creator of economic growth, cannot be counted among the factors that generated the great leap forward between the 1920s and 1950s. For the missing causes, we must look elsewhere. Capital and TFP, the mid-century explosion of productivity. Standard production theory relates output to the quantity and quality of labor and capital. The preceding section examined the role of changes in the quality of labor made possible by higher educational attainment. Changes in the quantity and quality of capital are another possible source of the jump in labor productivity between the 1920s and 1950s. As economists in the early 1960s marveled over the richness of John Kendrick's seminal 1961 contribution to the data of growth accounting, one startling change leaped off the page. The ratio of output to capital input, the average productivity of capital, almost doubled between the 1920s and the 1950s. The doubling is reproduced in Figure 16.4, which displays the ratio of GDP to capital input from 1920 to 1972. The upper line shows the ratio of real GDP to the same concept of capital that Kendrick used, as updated from current data sources. After hovering very close to 100% of the 1928 value during 1923 to 29, the ratio dropped to 78% during the worst years of the Great Depression, returned to 95% in 1935, and 144% in 1941, and then reached a peak of 220% during 1944. The big surprise came after the war, when many economists predicted that the economy would sink back into the dire conditions of the 1930s. The output-capital ratio dropped only to 176% in 1950, an enormous change compared to 1928, and the average ratio between 1950 and 1972 was 185%. Subsequent research summarized in the data appendix has identified three sets of measurement issues that contribute to the jump of the output-to-capital ratio between the 1920s and 1950s. Because mismeasurement causes capital to be understated in the 1950s relative to the 1920s, substitution of a new adjusted series on capital input raises capital in the 1950s and, in tandem, reduces the output-to-capital ratio, as shown by the lower line in Figure 16.4. In contrast to the 1950 ratio of 176% based on the official data, that ratio in 1950 is a much lower 141% in the revised data. Thus, roughly half of the post-1935 jump in the output-to-capital ratio can be attributed to the measurement issues examined in the data appendix. Though the adjusted output-to-capital ratio shown as the lower line in Figure 16.4 was in 1972 still 147% of its 1928 value, gradually the ratio fell to 108% by 2013. Put simply, the nation's output grew much more quickly than its capital input between 1928 and 1972, and then much more slowly from 1972 to 2013. The annualized growth rate of the output-to-capital ratio between 1928 and 1972 was 0.9% per year and then fell at negative 0.8% per year from 1972 to 2013. This history raises deep questions that we will ponder for the rest of this chapter. What factors caused the adjusted ratio to increase from 100 in 1928 to an average of 150% during 1950 to 72? Many issues await our attention, including the effect of the Depression and war on production practices and industrial efficiency, as well as the underlying pace of innovation from the 1920s to the 1950s and beyond. We now have all the ingredients needed to determine the growth history of total factor productivity, TFP, the best available measure of innovation and technological change. The calculation of TFP is mechanical and equals output divided by a weighted average of labor and capital input, with standard weights of 0.7 for labor and 0.3 for capital. Labor input equals aggregate hours of work multiplied by an index of educational attainment. Capital input equals the adjusted concept developed in the data appendix. The resulting growth rates of TFP are displayed in Figure 16.5, which displays the annual growth rate of TFP for each decade between the initial decade, 1890 to 1900, and the extended decade, 2000 to 2014. The horizontal labels identify the final year of each decade, and so the highest bar in the graph, labeled 1950, refers to the average annual growth rate of TFP during the decade 1940 to 50. This history of TFP growth has the appearance of an up and down staircase, with the steps of unequal height. The singularity of the 1940 to 50 decade leaps off the page. This graph confirms Alex Field's emphasis on the 1930s as a more productive decade than the 1920s, as well as the pickup in TFP growth in the 1920s compared to the 1890 to 1920 interval. Called into question is the verdict by Moses Abramowitz and Paul David regarding World War II, that the war imposed restrictions on civilian investment, caused a serious reduction in private capital accumulation, and retarded normal productivity growth. Labor productivity in TFP soared during World War II, and the cessation of defense production did not prevent the wartime productivity gains from becoming permanent. The TFP growth history laid out in Figure 16.5 poses a daunting set of questions for the rest of the chapter. What was it about the innovation process that allowed TFP growth steadily to accelerate from the 1920s to 1930s to 1940s and then slow down thereafter? What was it about the growth process that allowed the level of TFP to remain high even after wartime production ceased in 1945 to 46? To what extent did the productivity explosion of the late 1930s and the 1940s benefit from inventions and innovations in the 1920s and 1930s that had a delayed impact? In the next section, the analysis begins with the effects of economic distribution in the 1930s and 1940s, and subsequently turns to the timing and effect of inventions during the first half of the 20th century. Explanations rooted in the disruptions of the Great Depression and World War II. What were the causes of the epical jump in the output-to-capital ratio and of TFP between 1928 and 1950? To what extent could the causes be connected to the disruptions associated with the Great Depression and World War II? The first topic is the interplay between rapidly rising real wages and declining hours per week, both of which made labor more expensive to employ. The second issue is complementary, the effect of cost-cutting during the desperate decade of the 1930s that forced firms to make do with fewer employees, and the high-pressure priority for maximum production during World War II that had the same effect of raising labor productivity through some combination of higher machine speeds and greater work effort. The third effect is the role of government infrastructure that was built in the 1930s, and whether this would have occurred had the Great Depression not occurred. Rising real wages. Earlier this chapter, we have traced the upward surge of the real wage of production workers during the 1930s, and attributed it in large part to New Deal pro-labor legislation. Did the rising real wage cause a substitution away from labor toward capital? Though capital spending was depressed during the 1930s and during World War II, this was mainly true for structures, which accounted for 77% of the value of the capital stock in 1928. Equipment investment rebounded strongly in the 1930s. The ratio of equipment investment to the value of equipment capital was 13.6% in 1928, but rose above that to 14.4% in 1936, 16.1% in 1937, 15.8% in 1940, and 17.1% in 1941. At least some part of this buoyant performance of equipment investment may have represented a substitution from labor to capital that raised labor productivity. Moreover, the new capital investment of the late 1930s reflected continuing innovation. Railroad locomotives, trucks, tractors, and industrial equipment manufactured in the late 1930s were all of substantially higher quality than their counterparts of the 1920s. The high-pressure economy of World War II. All the indexes of output, hours of work, and productivity soared during 1942 to 45. This is not surprising, for the entire economy converted to a maximum production regime in which every machine and structure was used 24 hours per day, if enough workers could be found to staff 3 shifts. As shown in Figure 16.2, previously labor productivity did not exhibit even a hiccup of decline after 1945. Though hours per capita collapsed as Rosie the Riveter switched roles from factory worker to mother in the baby boom, labor productivity continued to rise farther above its 1870 to 1928 trend. As early as 1941, the economy was straining against a shortage of capacity in manufacturing. The capacity use rate for the steel industry reached 97% in 1941. As high as in any other year during World War II. Machine tools were in short supply as early as the spring of 1940, and by the spring of 1941, the owner of a leading machine tool supplier shook his head at the backlogs, stating that the demand is infinite. Though the most famous example of learning by doing was the drastic reduction in the number of days needed to produce a standard Liberty freighter ship, built by Henry Kaiser in his Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon shipyards, the pressure for maximum production must have yielded permanent improvements in production techniques under conditions of war that would not have occurred in peacetime. The Kaiser shipyards began in 1942 with a schedule of fully 8 months to complete a Liberty ship, but by the next year, the completion time had been reduced to a few weeks. In a unique contest between the two shipyards, an entire ship was actually put together at each yard from prefabricated parts in 4 days. This supreme production achievement was made possible in part by letters from more than 250 employees, suggesting ways to make production more efficient. The shipyard example can be generalized to the entire manufacturing sector. Recent accounts of the arsenal of democracy focus not just on the Kaiser shipyards, but also on Henry Ford's mammoth factory that built B-24 bombers. The Ford plant was built in less than a year, starting in March 1941, and turned out its first plane in May 1942. The plant had originally been designed to produce bombers at the unbelievable rate of 1 per hour, but it was a long struggle to achieve that rate. In a classic example of learning by doing, the production rate gradually increased, reaching 75 per month in February 1943, 150 per month in November 1943, and a peak of 432 per month in August 1944. And the Kaiser and Ford examples were only the best known of continuous learning by doing throughout the war in the form of continuous cost reduction and efficient improvement. Pontiac had reduced the cost of its complex Oerlikon anti-aircraft gun by 23%. Chrysler's Dodge Division engineers figured out how to make shortwave radar systems at 57% less cost than 8 months earlier. The company's gyro compasses were costing 55% of the original fee. Throughout the war, patriotism and the sense of purpose bonded workers and management together, and workers were more eager to raise efficiency, often in ways that made their lives easier than before. The most obvious reason why productivity remained high after World War II, despite the end of the military emergency, is that technological change does not regress. People do not forget. Once progress is made, no matter under what circumstances, it is permanent. The impressive performance of productivity in the late 1930s suggests that had aggregate demand collapsed after World War II, as defense spending dried up, the toll would have been taken on employment rather than on productivity. But demand did not dry up. Rather, it shifted almost immediately from military to civilian purchases. In 1946 to 47, the floodgates of demand were let loose, and after swift reconversion, manufacturers strained to meet the demand for refrigerators, stoves, washing machines, dryers, and dishwashers, not to mention automobiles and television sets. As they struggled to fill orders that seemed almost infinite, they adopted all that they had learned about efficient production in the high-pressure economy of World War II. Virtually every firm making consumer goods, except for basic food and clothing products, had been forced to make something else during World War II, and every one of these producers learned to be more efficient from the process. During the war, jewelry makers made artillery fuses, producers of lawnmowers made shrapnel shells, manufacturers of postal meters made bomb mechanisms, makers of men's shoes made helmet liners, manufacturers of vacuum cleaners made gas mask parts, and makers of wheelbarrows shifted to production of ammunition carts for machine guns. Every part of the post-war manufacturing sector had been deeply involved in making military equipment or its components, and the lessons learned from the war translated into permanent efficiency gains after the war. Though wartime production demands may have had a permanent effect in raising the use of capital and the level of efficiency, earlier attempts to smooth the production flow and raise efficiency date back to the 1920s. Then began a deliberate managerial effort to improve use of facilities and to save on inventories of in-process of finished products. This might help to explain the paradox of rising labor productivity and TFP growth in the 1930s, despite the decline in the overall utilization of capital and labor. New methods were making it possible to raise the output-to-capital ratio and TFP despite low aggregate demand, helping explain why the Great Depression reduced input of labor hours more than it reduced labor productivity. This has been attributed in part to the shift in the structure of retailing to large corporations such as Marshall Field, Macy's, and Sears Roebuck, which demanded a constant flow of goods from their suppliers. There is a debate in the literature about whether World War II improved consumer welfare. Despite the prohibition of production of most durable goods, real consumption per capita, $2,009, remained roughly the same in 1944 as in 1941. Robert Higgs has argued that the official data on real personal consumption expenditures are overstated, because the growth of true consumer prices in the wartime regime of price controls is substantially understated. If the data on current dollar consumption are correct, then any unmeasured increase in true consumer prices becomes an unmeasured decrease of the same percentage magnitude in real consumption spending. Sources of unmeasured price increases include bribes, black markets, and unmeasured declines in the quality of goods and services, including the need to wait in lines and distort consumption choices due to rationing, crowding due to migration, and a shortage of housing exacerbated by declines in rental housing maintenance due to rent controls. Three responses to this critique range from narrow to broad. At the narrow level, the shift of 12 million people, or 9% of the 1940 population, into the armed forces implies that there were 9% fewer civilians to share the available personal consumption expenditures. Because measured real consumption was roughly the same in 1944 as in 1941, this implies that real consumption per civilian increased by 9%. There may well have been measurement errors, but these would have had to be greater than 9% for us to conclude that there was any decline in real personal consumption expenditures per member of the civilian population. All the food, clothing, and housing for the 12 million in the military, whether it be in barracks, camps, or on ships, was provided by the government and counted in wartime government spending rather than personal consumption expenditures. A broader and more important point is that the wartime prosperity, despite its inconveniences, marked a sea change in the outlook and expectations of the entire nation after a decade of grinding depression and unemployment that appeared without end, a world of secular stagnation, in the famous phrase of Harvard's Alvin Hansen. The Great Depression had a searingly negative effect on the nation's sense of well-being. Through most of the 1930s, a sizable portion of the population was badly fed, clothed, and housed. This extreme poverty was eliminated by the war economy. The reduction in the economic distance between the least well-off and the rest of the population significantly lifted everyone's sense of well-being. Thus, the stagnant material consumption levels of World War II may not have been thought very important for much of the population. Even if 1944 total consumption was no higher than 1941, the year 1941 seemed like paradise, as it achieved a level of total real consumption fully 28% higher than the average annual consumption expenditures of 1930 to 39. Indeed, despite his negative assessment of consumer welfare in World War II, Higgs agrees with this broader point. The war economy broke the back of the pessimistic expectations almost everybody had come to hold during the seemingly endless depression. In the long decade of the 1930s, especially its latter half, many people had come to believe that the economic machine was irreparably broken. The frenetic activity of war production dispelled the hopelessness. People began to think, if we can produce all these planes, ships, and bombs, we can also turn out prodigious quantities of cars and refrigerators. The third and even more important point is that this chapter is not about how much was produced or consumed during World War II, but rather how and why the economy was able to achieve such a great leap in labor productivity and total factor productivity when the 1950s are compared to the pre-1928 growth trend. The war itself may have contributed to post-war achievement directly, as explored in this section, or may, by distorting the timing of economic advance, have masked the influence of innovations and other forms of progress that were already well underway in the years leading up to 1941. Wartime facilities. Though private capital input stagnated during 1930 to 45, the amount of capital input financed by the government surged ahead throughout that 15-year interval. Of particular interest was the creation of new plant facilities paid for by the government, but operated by private firms to produce military equipment and supplies. The wages, salaries, and profits earned in these government-owned plants were counted as part of national income, originating in the private sector. Studies of productivity and TFP growth have traditionally compared real value added in the private sector with capital input financed by the private sector, neglecting the World War II government-financed increases in the nation's stock of structures and productive equipment. The starkest omission from the data on capital used in World War II product comes from a single startling fact. The number of machine tools in the U.S. doubled from 1940 to 1945, and almost all of these new machine tools were paid for by the government rather than by private firms. Not all the government-financed facilities were in manufacturing. In 1942 to 44, as an emergency measure, the government financed the construction of the Big Inch and Little Big Inch petroleum pipelines over 1,300 miles from Texas to New Jersey to provide for the safe shipment of oil in wartime conditions when the previous method of transport by sea was threatened by German submarine attacks. Both pipelines became part of the nation's post-war infrastructure and are in use to this day. Some of the government-owned factories were on a massive and unprecedented scale. Previously, we have cited learning by doing at Henry Ford's government-financed plant in Willow Run, Michigan, which at its 1944 peak was producing one bomber per hour in what was called the world's greatest room. Fully 50,000 workers were employed there. The feat of bringing together millions of parts and fasteners at stations extending linearly for more than half a mile was unprecedented in the history of mass production. Necessity was the mother of invention, and the Ford Willow Run plant, together with the Kaiser shipyards, stands as perhaps the most persuasive example that World War II created a permanent increase in what firms, equipment, and workers could achieve together under the pressure of a government-financed regime that guaranteed fixed markups, for example, consistent profits, and real wages higher than any workforce had known from the beginning of time. Henry Ford perhaps said it best in the epigraph that begins this chapter. In 1942 to 45, the production genius of the United States, led by the automobile industry, stretched its imagination to perform feats never before imagined. But after imagination took over and the wartime goals were achieved, the economy did not forget. Long-term explanations, urbanization, the closed economy, and the improvement of capital quality. Urbanization and the decline of farming. Now we turn to the complementary set of explanations of the Great Leap Forward that do not rely on specific events related to the Great Depression or World War II. In searching for explanations of the rapid growth of TFP after 1929, we start with urbanization, which, by moving workers from less productive agricultural jobs to more productive urban occupations, contributes to the economy-wide advance of TFP growth. Did urbanization advance at a quicker pace between 1920 and 1960 than it had before or has since? The urban share during the slow productivity growth period of 1890 to 1920 grew from 35.1% to 50.8%. From 1920 to 1960, it rose from 50.8% to 69.7%, about the same rate per decade. Thus, urbanization by itself does not explain the post-1928 acceleration in productivity and TFP growth. Immigration and imports. Between 1870 and 1913, roughly 30 million immigrants arrived on American shores. They crowded into central cities but also populated the Midwest and the Plains states. They made possible the rapid population growth rate of 2.1% per year over the same interval. And the new immigrants created as much demand as supply, in the sense that there was no mass unemployment caused by their arrival. And in fact, the unemployment rate in 1913 was only 4.3%. All those new people required structures to house them, factories to work in, and equipment inside the factories. So the new immigrants contributed to the rapid rise of capital input. Contrast this with the shriveling up of immigration after the restrictive immigration laws of 1921 and 1924. The ratio of annual immigration to the U.S. population dropped off from an average 1.0% per year during 1909 to 13 to 0.25% per year during 1925 to 29, and the growth rate of the population fell from 2.1% during 1870 to 1913 to 0.9% between 1926 and 1945. The anti-immigration legislation has long been cited as a cause of the Great Depression, in the sense that the overbuilding of residential and non-residential structures in the 1920s was based on an expectation of continued rapid population growth that did not occur. Both the immigration legislation and the draconian regime of high tariffs, the Ford-McCumber Tariff of 1922 and the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, converted the U.S. into a relatively closed economy during the 3 decades between 1930 and 1960. The lack of competition for jobs from recent immigrants made it easier for unions to organize and push up wages in the 1930s. The high tariff wall allowed American manufacturing to introduce all available innovations into U.S.-based factories without the outsourcing that has become common in the last several decades. The lack of competition from immigrants and imports boosted the wages of workers at the bottom and contributed to the remarkable Great Compression of the income distribution during the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. Thus, the closing of the American economy through restrictive immigration legislation and high tariffs may indirectly have contributed to the rise of real wages in the 1930s. The focus of innovative investment in the domestic economy, and the general reduction of inequality from the 1920s to the 1950s. Can the innovations of the 1920s and 1930s explain the Great Leap? Our account in Part 1 of this book of the Great Inventions distinguishes between the original invention and the subsidiary inventions made possible by the initial invention. The 2 most important inventions of the late 19th century were electric light and power and the internal combustion engine, and these are often described as general-purpose technology, GPT, that can lead to the creation of many sub-inventions. Sub-inventions made possible by electricity as a GPT are such fundamental drivers of productivity as elevators, electric hand and machine tools, electric streetcars, elevated trains, and underground subways, the whole host of consumer appliances starting with the electric iron and vacuum cleaner, and followed by the refrigerator, washing machine, clothes dryer, dishwasher, and many others, and finally air conditioning, which arrived in movie theaters in the 1920s, in some office buildings in the 1930s, and in the American home in the 1950s and 1960s. A similar list of sub-inventions made possible by the internal combustion engine as a GPT includes the car, truck, bus, and taxi, supermarkets, suburbs, and all the aspects of personal travel, including motels and roadside restaurants, as well as air travel. Though we have no need to choose between electricity and the internal combustion engine as the most important GPT of all time, an author in 1932 provided a persuasive case that the most important invention of all time was the discovery of how to transform mechanical power into electricity, which then could be transported by wires for long distances and then retransformed into whatever form of energy might be desired. This passage is interesting also for its perspective on how much of the modern world had already been invented at the time of its writing in 1932. Without it, not only would the streetcar again be horse-drawn, but the automobile and the airplane would stop. For without electromagnetic sparking devices, how could gasoline engines function? The electric light would, of course, disappear, and with it, the great guarantee of safety after twilight in the great cities. The telephone and telegraph would be idle, and the daily newspaper would therefore become of merely local interest. Radio, telegraphy, telephony, and broadcasting would all disappear. Power plants would have to be associated with every separate factory, because long-distance transmission of power would cease. The rivers could furnish power only to factories situated on their banks. Hospital practice would again be without X-ray appliances, and households would be without electric-worked lightning devices. Ships in distress at sea, no longer able to signal their SOS calls, and no longer provided with gyro compass, radio direction finding, or fire signaling apparatus, would often sink, as formerly with none to rescue or help. Those attempting to explain the Great Leap Forward in terms of inventions often cite Alfred Kleinknecht, 1987, who counted up inventions by decade and declared that the decade with the greatest number of important inventions was the 1930s. In fact, if we include the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, these 3 decades contributed 26 out of the 39 most important inventions in Kleinknecht's list of the 12 decades between 1850 and 1970. My reading of the history of invention suggests the reverse, that the 1930s were distinguished by subsidiary sub-inventions rather than the discovery of fundamental GPTs. For instance, the 1930s were a defining decade in the perfection of the piston-powered military and commercial aircraft. But this was not a new GPT. It represented the marriage of the 1879 invention of the internal combustion engine with the 1903 aerodynamic design of the Wright brothers that made possible the first flight. Similarly, the invention of television in the 1920s and 1930s combined the 1879 invention of wireless transmission with the 1907 Lee de Forest invention of the vacuum tube, which had previously made commercial radio possible. Alexopoulos and Cohen, 2010, have made an important contribution to the history of innovation, although their study is limited to 1909 to 49. They criticize the use of patent data as a measure of the pace of innovation for 2 basic reasons. Because the date of the basic invention may be decades earlier than the introduction of a commercially viable version, and because a patent provides no information about the future commercial viability of the idea. Instead, they conduct an exhaustive search of the Library of Congress catalog for handbooks and other books about technology, and compare the date of the first book or books on an innovation with its date of initial commercialization. Their count supports Field's emphasis on the 1930s, especially after 1934, as a period having a larger count of technical books published than any other interval in their 40-year period. The average number was between 500 and 600 between 1911 and 1934, then soared monotonically to 930 in 1941, and averaged about 750 between 1942 and 1949. Worthy of consideration as a GPT is Henry Ford's introduction of the assembly line to automobile manufacture, dating from December 1, 1913. Developed from the ideas of many predecessors, dating back to Richard Garrett's 1953 English steam engine factory, the assembly line revolutionized manufacturing and deserves equal credit with electric motors for achieving the acceleration of TFP growth, which began in the 1920s, as is evident in Figure 16.5. Moses Abramowitz and Paul David attribute the rapid spread of the techniques of mass production to Ford's deliberate policy of openness about his detailed methods of operation that contributed to the rapid diffusion of these new techniques throughout American manufacturing. It is interesting to contrast the very slow arrival of electric motors in manufacturing, as emphasized by the same David as contrasted to the rapid diffusion of the assembly line technique. The assembly line, together with electric-powered tools, utterly transformed manufacturing. Before 1913, goods were manufactured by craftsmen at individual stations that depended for power on steam engines and leather or rubber belts. The entire product would be crafted by 1 or 2 employees. Compare that with a decade later, when each worker had control of electric-powered machine tools and hand tools, with production organized along the Ford assembly line principle. An additional aspect of the assembly line was that it saved capital, particularly floor space, inventories in storage rooms, and shortening of time in process. It is likely that electric power and the assembly line explain not just the TFP growth upsurge of the 1920s, but also that of the 1930s and 1940s. There are two types of evidence that this equipment capital was becoming more powerful and more electrified. First is the horsepower of prime movers, a data series available for selected years for different types of productive capital, and the second is kilowatt hours of electricity production. Analysts have long emphasized the role of both horsepower and electricity use as explanations of high productivity in American manufacturing relative to other nations. Table 16.2 displays on the top line for selected years the constant dollar value of private equipment capital developed in the data appendix. Total horsepower is shown as an index number, 1929 equals 100, for four categories of equipment: automotive, factories, farms, and electric central stations. In absolute magnitude, the horsepower installed in the nation's fleet of vehicles swamped every other type of equipment capital. But unfortunately, the horsepower data do not distinguish automobiles used for personal travel from those used for business travel, nor from trucks and buses. Milestones for automotive horsepower include the surpassing of the horsepower of work animals by 1910 and of railroads by 1915. Horsepower in factories increased much more slowly, and the index numbers for 1940 and 1950 are very similar to those for the private equipment series. A puzzling aspect of the factory horsepower data is the absence of any growth in the 1920s. Horsepower on farms and in electric generating stations increased more rapidly than private equipment after 1929. Because any index of total horsepower is swamped by the automotive category, we take a simple arithmetic average of the index numbers for automotive, factories, and farms, omitting electric utility generation on the ground that it is an intermediate good rather than private investment. The ratio of horsepower to equipment capital, shown on line 7 of Table 16.2, rose modestly by 13% per decade during 1899 to 1919, then accelerated to 24% per decade in the 1920s, 21% in the 1930s, and 17% in the 1940s. Unlike the horsepower series, which starts out with a substantial base of installed steam power in 1899, the kilowatt-hour series starts from zero in 1882 and thus would be expected to exhibit the fastest growth rates in its early years. Nevertheless, impressive growth is registered in the 1930s and 1940s. Particularly noteworthy is the series on electricity generated by industrial establishments, which grew by 57% between 1929 and 1941, more quickly than the 36% of the 1920s or 31% of the 1940s. When expressed as a ratio to private equipment capital, the growth rate of industry-generated electricity grew at 18% in the 1920s, 36% in the 1930s, and only 3% in the 1940s. The ratio of total kilowatt-hours, most of which was generated by electric utilities, to private equipment capital grew at 54% in the 1920s, 37% in the 1930s, and 34% in the 1940s. Overall, the increase in the horsepower of motor vehicles and the use of electricity rose much more quickly than did equipment capital in the 1930s and 1940s. While the stock of private equipment rose by 50% in logs between 1929 and 1950, motor vehicle horsepower tripled and total electricity production rose by 3.3 times. Total registrations increased between 1929 and 1941 by 45% for trucks and more than tripled for buses. All these additional trucks and buses were much more powerful in 1941 than they had been in 1929, though we do not have separate horsepower data for trucks and buses. We learned before in Table 5.2 that automobile horsepower in a typical popular low-priced car increased from 20 horsepower in Ford's Model T, which dominated the 1913 to 25 interval, to 40 horsepower in Ford's Model A, introduced in 1928, to 85 horsepower in the 1940 Chevrolet. The horsepower of trucks and buses must have increased at comparable rates. Field finds that the most important industries contributing to the productivity upsurge of the 1930s were manufacturing and transportation/distribution. This chapter thus far has pointed to two separate sources of productivity growth in transportation distribution: the heavy government investment in highways and the much higher horsepower of the nation's trucking fleet in 1941 compared to 1929. The rapid rise of electricity production after 1929 by industrial enterprises provides solid evidence that the use of electricity by industrial machinery grew rapidly during the 1930s and contradicts Field's judgment that the 1930s represented the tail end of the electrification transition. Higher electricity use in the 1930s reflected the continuing adaptation to electric equipment, not just in manufacturing, but also in the form of refrigerated cases in wholesaling and retailing, and the widespread use of electric production methods in the rest of the economy, including the earliest examples of air-conditioned movie theaters and office buildings. The great expansion of electricity production in the 1930s and 1940s was made possible by economies of scale, for larger electric generating boilers produced electricity at a lower unit cost. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, increasing size was combined with higher temperatures and pressures as technology made tightly sealed boilers more reliable. The evolution of higher thermal efficiency and productivity in the electric utility example is an example not of a breakthrough invention, but of incremental tinkering, a constant striving to improve existing technology. Totally new inventions as well as incremental tinkering are the fundamental sources of growth in TFP, and the data do not allow us to distinguish between them. Beyond the productivity-enhancing role of electricity and the internal combustion engine, which innovations drove productivity growth in the 1930s and 1940s? The distribution system was revolutionized by the movement to chain stores and self-service stores that started around 1910 and continued during the 1920s and 1930s. The number of chain food stores quadrupled during the 1920s, achieving a major boost to productivity. But chain stores initially operated by the old-fashioned counter and shelf system, in which the customer stood in line at each separate department, and the clerk both selected the item from the shelf and received payment. It was when chain stores developed self-service, much of which happened after 1930, that the real productivity gains occurred as the customers did the walking and selecting, and the number of employees needed to run a store fell by half or more. As important as was progress in the transportation and distribution industries, innovation and discoveries exploded after 1929 in the petroleum and related chemical industries. An epical moment in the history of the American petroleum industry occurred with the discovery, in October 1930, of the East Texas oil field, which has been called the largest and most prolific oil reservoir in the contiguous United States. The chemicals industry, dominated by German firms in the late 19th century, took off in the U.S. in the 1930 to 50 period. Many types of plastics had been invented before 1930. Among these were celluloid, 1863, polyvinyl chloride, 1872, cellophane, 1908, Bakelite, 1909, and vinyl, 1927. But the timeline of plastics inventions highlights the 1930s as perhaps the most fruitful innovative period in the history of the industry, with polyvinylidene chloride, 1933, low-density polyethylene, 1935, acrylic methacrylate, 1936, polyurethanes, 1937, polystyrene, 1938, Teflon, 1938, nylon, 1939, and neoprene, 1939. Of all the inventions on the plastics timeline, 5 were invented between 1839 and 1894, 4 more between 1894 and 1927, and 7 in the brief period 1933 to 39. Field lists numerous practical byproducts of developments in the chemical industries in the 1930s, including coatings that doubled the lives of railroad ties, quick-drying lacquers that reduced the time required to paint a car from a few weeks to a few hours, and the introduction of stainless steel and chrome. Plastics often saved fuel, fabrication, and capital costs. The productivity of motor vehicles depended not only on the power of their engines, which increased rapidly from 1920 to 1940, but also on the quality of their tires. Advances in rubber technology made it possible to equip trucks and tractors with larger and more durable tires. In fact, the early 1930s were the period when tractors became powerful enough and their tires became large enough to allow the revolution in agricultural productivity, which they made possible. Field conjectures about the role of larger engines and better tires, along with the first, pre-interstate, national highway system in allowing trucks to begin in the 1930s to compete with rail as a carrier of the nation's freight. A much more prosaic but very important improvement happened in the 1920s that represents a potential source of productivity gains. The American manufacturing system had always been known for standardization and its ability to turn out identical components of a product. In Chapter 2, we recorded the marvel of European observers at the 1851 Crystal Palace expedition of the American achievement. Almost all of the American machines did things that the world earnestly wished machines to do. But standardization of parts was not achieved in 1851. There was a proliferation of multiple products for which the purpose was identical. In 1917, it was disclosed that the number of different varieties of single-bit axe offered for sale in the United States to chop down a tree was 994,840. In this wide range were 34 models, 4 grades, 35 brands, 11 finishes, and 19 sizes. One of the most important improvements in American industrial efficiency was the establishment by Herbert Hoover of the National Bureau of Standards. Its aim was to create a system of uniformly sized parts, down to screws and bolts, aimed at simplification of practice, elimination of waste, conservation of materials, minimum training of workers, reduction and savings in supply purchasing and unwieldy inventories, defeat of confusion, and speed in production. One of the triumphs of standardization was the production of millions of universal joints during World War II, required to transform uniform velocity from the driving to the driven shaft of high-speed vehicles. Standardization of parts allowed the Bendix design for these joints to be manufactured by 23 additional companies that had no previous experience. An enormous improvement of industrial efficiency was made possible by standardization of such mundane components as nuts, bolts, and screws, and the drive to standardization that had begun in the 1920s. Conclusion. What caused the Great Leap Forward? The most fundamental question of modern economic history is why, after 2 millennia of no growth at all in per capita real output from Roman times to 1750, economic growth moved out of its hibernation and began to wake up. More relevant for our times is the second most important question: why growth has slowed since the 1960s and early 1970s, not only in the United States and Japan, but also in much of Western Europe. Though the timing of economic growth in Japan and Europe was different as a result of wartime destruction and interwar economic disruption, the slowdown is real. Indeed, during the past 2 decades, labor productivity in the European Union has grown at half the pace of the United States. The third question is the focus of this chapter: why U.S. economic growth was so rapid during the middle of the 20th century, particularly between 1928 and 1950. The topic of this chapter focuses on the timing of U.S. economic growth and is as simple as it is perplexing. Why does a decadal plot of growth in U.S. labor productivity and TFP since 1890 look like a trek over a mountain, gradually ascending to the decade of the 1940s and gradually descending since then? The second and third questions are intertwined, for the post-1972 growth slowdown is considered a disappointment precisely because the pace of growth during 1928 to 72 was so rapid and so unprecedented. The answers to both the second and third questions are fundamental to this book. This chapter has sought to quantify and then determine the causes of the great leap of labor productivity and TFP growth between the late 1920s and early 1950s, thus accounting for how TFP growth in the decades of 1930 to 40 and 1940 to 50 outpaced any others in American history. What was so special about that 2-decade interval in which normal economic activity was disrupted by the Great Depression and World War II? There are many possible explanations, and it is impossible to rank the quantitative importance of most. However, throughout this chapter, we have been able to rule out several potential causes. Education is ruled out, for the secular advance in educational attainment was just as important between 1910 to 28 and 1950 to 72 as between 1928 to 50. Similarly, the shift of Americans from rural farms and small towns to urban life in places having more than 2,500 population proceeded, if anything, slightly slower during 1928 to 50 than it had between 1870 and 1928. The most novel aspect of this chapter is its suggestion that the Great Depression and World War II directly contributed to the Great Leap. Had there been no Great Depression, there probably would have been no New Deal with its NIRA and Wagner Act that promoted unionization and that directly and indirectly contributed to a sharp rise in real wages and a shrinkage in average weekly hours. In turn, both higher real wages and shorter hours helped to boost productivity growth rapidly in the late 1930s before the United States entered World War II. Substitution from labor to capital as a result of the jump in the real wage is evident in the data on private equipment investment, which soared in 1937 to 41, substantially above the equipment investment to capital ratio of the late 1920s. Another more subtle effect of the Great Depression may have been the reorganization of business after the sharp drop in output and profits generated severe cost-cutting, most notably in the dismissal of employees. Yet output did not fall to zero in the 1930s, and the output that was produced with a lower number of employees reflected new ideas and techniques of efficiency, many of them carried over from the 1920s. Our evidence on the horsepower of motor vehicles, which greatly increased over the 1930s, suggests that the power and efficiency of electric machine tools and hand tools may have similarly experienced a substantial improvement in the 1930s. Indeed, our evidence in Table 16.2 implies that there was a sustained increase during 1929 to 50 in horsepower per unit of constant cost capital equipment, as well as a vast increase in the amount of electricity consumed per unit of capital. Less speculative is the productivity-enhancing learning by doing that occurred during the high-pressure economy of World War II. Economists have long studied the steady improvement over time in the speed and efficiency with which Liberty freighter ships were built. The most remarkable aspect of the surge in labor productivity during World War II is that it appears to have been permanent. Despite the swift reduction in wartime defense spending during 1945 to 47, labor productivity did not decline at all during the immediate post-war years. The necessity of war became the mother of invention of improved production techniques, and these innovations, large and small, were not forgotten after the war. In addition to the increased efficiency of existing plant and equipment, the federal government financed an entirely new part of the manufacturing sector, with newly built plants and newly purchased productive equipment. The high level of post-war productivity was made possible in part because the number of machine tools in the U.S. doubled between 1940 and 1945. The amount of additional productive equipment that the federal government purchased to produce private sector output was staggering. Between 1940 and 1945, the federal government purchased productive equipment that amounted to roughly 50% of the stock of privately owned equipment that existed before the war in 1941. And because it was all purchased between 1941 and 1945, this capital was more modern and productive than the stock of privately owned capital that existed in 1941. Going beyond explanations that emerge from the sequence of the Great Depression, followed by World War II, we need to consider the pace of innovation itself. Perhaps the most important source of the Great Leap Forward was the increased quality of machinery, as represented by the large increases in horsepower and kilowatt-hour of electricity usage per dollar of equipment capital. For every 100 units of electricity that were added to the productive process during 1902 to 29, another 230 units were added between 1929 and 1950. Paul David has rightly emphasized the long delay between the first electric power station in 1882 and the revolution in manufacturing productivity in the early 1920s. But this focus on the 1920s as the breakthrough decade misses that the full force of electricity expansion in manufacturing and the rest of the economy took place between 1929 and 1950. The trauma of the Great Depression did not slow down the American invention machine. If anything, the pace of innovation picked up in the last half of the 1930s. This is clear in the data assembled by Alexopoulos and Cohen on technical books published. The dominance of the 1930s, or more generally the period 1920 to 1950, is supported by Kleinknecht's count of inventions by decade. Previous chapters have provided evidence of rapid progress in radio, the quality of motion pictures, and a sharp jump in the quality of motor cars. By 1940, automobile manufacturers had achieved the dream of producing automobiles that could go as quickly as the highways would allow them to travel. The development of highways worthy of this technical marvel would wait until the construction of the interstate highway system, largely achieved during 1958 to 72. Little attention has been paid in this book to oil and plastics, for these are intermediate goods. However, from the discovery of the East Texas oil field to the development of many types of plastics now considered commonplace, the 1930s added to its luster as a decade of technological advance. The use of plastics in every kind of producer and consumer durable was on the cusp of reality in 1941, before production was diverted to wartime uses. A favorite photograph of the hardships of the World War II home front shows women painting stripes on their legs to replace the rayon and nylon stockings that were no longer available. Two overriding conclusions emerge from this study of one of the great puzzles of economic growth. First, World War II saved the U.S. economy from secular stagnation. and a hypothetical scenario of economic growth after 1939 that does not include the war looks dismal at best. Second, much more than in traditional economic history, the great inventions of the late 19th century, especially electricity and the internal combustion engine, continued to alter production methods beyond recognition, not just in the 1920s, but in the 1930s and 1940s as well. Alex Field revitalized U.S. economic history by his startling claim that the 1930s were the most progressive decade. For us to determine that labor productivity and TFP growth were even quicker during 1941 to 50 does not diminish the boldness of Field's imagination with his claim or the depth of evidence that he has marshaled to support it.
Please subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss another update. Please like, share and comment.